Ag diolch yn fawr iawn, ag noswaith da i chi gyd. Mae'n bleser fel arfer siarad yn enwedig ar bwnc sydd yn agos iawn iawn ar y gwir i'm calon ni. Ag perhaps some of you will be able to enjoy an hour away from the horrors of Ukraine and concentrate instead on something as innocent as walking. What I'm going to do now is just to start sharing my screen with you. So if you'll just hang on for a second, I can do that. And I hope you can all now see the screen. I ceased being a working person about 10 years ago, and since then I've spent a lot of time doing two quite separate things. One is writing in various ways, including writing books, and the other is walking, in particular long distance walking. And so just recently I brought those two ideas together by starting to write a book about the history of walking and the history of walking in Wales. The Bible of walking, if anybody's interested in the literature of walking that already exists, the Bible of walking, for me at least, is this book by Rebecca Solnit. Rebecca Solnit is an American writer and activist, and she wrote a book a few years ago called Wanderlust, A History of Walking. It is a most marvelous book, covering literature and history and philosophy, all kinds of things. She takes the whole world as her stage, and I thought it would be an interesting thing to do a kind of mini Solnit, but to restrict myself to Wales, which is a bit more manageable but still very rich in walking stories. I've taken a chronological approach, roughly, starting as it happens in the Mesolithic period and then moving up to now. But I'm also working by theme and stopping, as you do when you walk along the way, to take a look around, particularly at some walkers who particularly interest me, walkers in Wales, that is. It's meant a lot of research and a lot of it online. It's not been easy in COVID to look at material in print or indeed in manuscript, but I've done my best so far. I've got about another 2 years to go. And I've now reached the interwar period, which is a kind of dark age, really, for walking. I've quite a long way to go yet. I'm looking at all kinds of walking, not only walking by Welsh people, but visitors to Wales, and for all kinds of reasons, for work, for walking to school, walking for pleasure, physical exercise, walking to commune with nature, pilgrimage. This is the old pilgrim at Strata, Florida, now sadly deceased. Walking for protest and demonstration, all kinds of walking. Most of the time, of course, we're not really aware that we're walking. We do it automatically, or we make an assumption about walking without giving it a lot of thought. It's not a deliberate act. But of course, for some people, many people, it is a deliberate act. For various reasons, to appreciate the world of nature, particularly in Wales, on mountains or by the sea. And there are lots of different ways of approaching the subject. There's philosophy, there's the history of culture, language and literature, art, economics, town planning, social conflict, almost anything you like. I started with footprints. There's no better way of introducing walking than by looking at your feet, or at least footprints. And very luckily, in Wales, along the Severn Estuary and elsewhere, we got signs of people walking in the Middle Stone Age period. And here on the left is one footprint it comes from Goldcliff, which is just to the east of Newport, in the intertidal area, in other words, between the two tides. Sometimes the sea uncovers series of footprints which clearly belong to that period. And you can deduce various things from them. For example, adults of the period were about 5.5 feet tall. There were children who were making these footprints too. Perhaps they were fishing in the area. And there are others of these all around the Severn estuary and at other sites around Wales. They give you a really vivid encounter with prehistoric people, maybe 20,000 years ago. On the left is something rather different. We now know that the bluestones which arrived in Stonehenge came from the Preseli Mountains, but we also know now exactly where they came from in the Preselis. And there is one theory by one archaeologist, Mike Parker Pearson, that the bluestones were actually erected in the Preselis at a place called mewn, before they were then uprooted and taken to Stonehenge. We also know, and this is where walking comes in, that they were walked along. They didn't go by sea, which was the previous theory. They were actually taken by land all the way to Wiltshire. In these days, of course, walking wasn't an easy thing to do. There was a lot of wood around, at least until the Bronze Age, and most people, if they were walking a long way, would walk along the ridgeways, and they wouldn't walk in the wooded valleys. So a ridgeway like the Kerry Ridgeway in Montgomeryshire would have been a busy road in prehistoric periods. When it comes to the Romans, we're on slightly ground because we can see Roman roads, or at least we can see the roots of them. This is the photo I took at a place called Blaen Llia, which is near Ystrad Felltey in the Forest Fawr. And it's a Roman road that connected Brecon, the fort there, and another fort further south at Coel Bren. And we'll come back to this because you'll see there's a stone standing up on the right-hand side. But this is certainly a Roman road, or at least the route of a Roman road. The Romans, of course, built roads all over Wales, and there was a whole network of them to link together both forts and towns and villages. In the so-called Dark Ages, after the Romans left, incidentally, here's a Roman shoe. This one, it's not a very good photograph. It comes from Tegontium, Carnarvon, the Roman fort there, belonged to a Roman soldier, made of leather. It doesn't look like a shoe now, but this is exactly the kind of shoe with studs underneath that the Roman soldiers would have used when they tramped around their roads. In the Dark Ages, the Roman roads continued in existence. They were very well built, and there was no reason not to use them after the Romans left. Now, the stone that you saw in a previous photo is this stone here. It's called Maen Madoc, and it has a Latin inscription on it, and it commemorates a man called Deavacius, son of Justus. So here was somebody who died in the 6th or 7th century AD, clearly using Latin still, even though the Romans had long gone, and it was erected right by the Roman road. So the Roman road was clearly still in use by people who were walking long distances in that time. Many Roman roads were given the name Sarn Helen, of course, in the Dark Ages, and we know from the Mabinogion, for example, that there were lots of stories about Sarn Helen. In the Age of the Saints, and we have various saints' lives, of course, that exist, most of them rather mythological, but one of the earliest was Saint Samson of Dol. We have his life, and he seems to have been educated in Llantwit Major, but he was a great walker. He walked long distances and ended up in Brittany at a place called Dol. And he was clearly a big walker. And the early saints did travel a great deal, both by sea and by land, and we have to assume they were great walkers. And we get a bit more of an insight into travelling in Wales, and particularly walking, by the year 1188, because this is the time when Geraldus Cambrensis, Gerald of Wales, or Gerallt Gymro, accompanied the Archbishop Baldwin on his great tour of Wales. The idea of the tour, by the two of them, and a whole lot of other people presumably, was to persuade people to join in the crusade. This was a crusade which King Henry II had started to go to Jerusalem and recover Jerusalem. It was a long, long journey. It was 760 miles right round Wales. It's reckoned, or I've reckoned anyway, that they did something like 18 miles a day or less. So presumably they were on horseback, or some of them were on horseback, but the speed was not much more than walking speed. What probably happened was that the VIPs, like the Archbishop and Gerald himself, were on horseback, and then the retinue just walked alongside. Now, unfortunately, Gerald, he gives a lot of information in his book about the trip, the itinerary of Wales, but he doesn't say, unfortunately, a lot about how they got around. Just occasionally you get a glimpse, though, and this is what he says about where they got towards the Neath River and had to try and cross it. So I'm going to just give you a taste now of what Gerald says. He says, as we approached the Neath, which is the most dangerous and difficult of access of all the rivers of South Wales, on account of its quicksands, which immediately engulf anything placed upon them, one of our pack horses, the only one possessed by the writer of these lines, was sucked down into the abyss. In the end, it was pulled out with some difficulty, thanks to the efforts made by our servants, who risked their lives in doing so, and not without some damage done to my books and my baggage. It was true that we had Morgan, the prince of these parts, as our guide, but we reached the river only after considerable danger and quite a few upsets. Against the advice of our leader, our fear of the unusual surface made us hurry across the quicksands. And as we came to realize that we won through, it's better to advance more slowly and with great circumspection over such dangerous terrain as this, we crossed the Neath in a boat and not by a ford, for the passages through the river change with every monthly tide, and they cannot be located at all after the heavy fall of rain, when the waters are swollen with floods and inundation. Well, this is how the estuary of the Neath looks today in its kind of post-industrial state, but it must have been a fairly terrifying prospect in Gerald's time. It's interesting that Gerald also, of course, went to Strata Florida on his travels. He was quite comfortable in South Wales, but once he got out of South Wales into Mid and North Wales, as a non-Welsh speaker, he felt increasingly uncomfortable. But he had a very interesting time at Strata Florida. He says, we reached Strata Florida that night and stayed there for a while. It's thought he may have stayed 3 days, in fact. From there, we journeyed on, leaving on our right the lofty mountains of Morwg. I don't quite know what Morwg is. He calls it Ellenydd in Welsh. And here we met, near the side of a wood, Cynnurig ap Rhys, who was accompanied by a band of lightly armed young men. Cynnurig was tall and handsome, with fair curly hair. He was dressed according to the custom of his race and country, for he wore only a thin cloak, and beneath that a shirt. His feet and legs were bare, and he seemed to care nothing for the thorns and thistles. He had a natural dignity, which owed nothing to affectation. He was, as it were, a man adorned by nature, not by art. In the presence of their father, Prince Rhys, we preached a sermon to his 3 sons. So this man was actually one of the sons of Rhys ap Griffith, the man who refounded the Cistercian Abbey. And Gerald seems to have been rather smitten by Cynnurig. One wonders about his gender orientation, in fact. Cynnurig seems to have played very little part in political life. The great historian, Sir John Lloyd, has a rather snide thing to say about him. He says, I quote, "He played no part in the strife of his day and carried his goodly presence to his grave without having in any way disturbed the tenor of his long life of dignified inaction." Well, maybe Sir John Lloyd was writing, you have to remember, before the First World War. Once Gerald reached Caernarfon, or just before it, we get another glimpse of him walking. He says, "We dismounted from our horses and we proceeded on foot, in intention at least, rehearsing what we thought we would experience when we went to our pilgrimage to Jerusalem. We walked the whole length of the valley, and we were very tired by the time we reached the farther end." When he was in North Wales, Gerald was, as I said, rather uncomfortable, and he didn't venture far into Snowdonia. He thought it was a very inaccessible place full of miracles and wonders. He thought there were 2 lakes in Snowdonia, including a floating one with an eagle that fed on dead men. And there were a lot of suspicions and superstitions in North Wales that he was very uncomfortable with. Gerald didn't go on the pilgrimage to Jerusalem. He was lucky. Baldwin did set out and in fact was killed. Later on in the Middle Ages, pilgrimage, of course, became a very, very common custom and commonly involved walking. And there were many, many pilgrimage sites in Wales, perhaps more so than in England. A pilgrimage was a real journey. It was a physical, long, dangerous journey sometimes, and usually on foot, unless you were very well off. It was also a spiritual journey, and very often it was a medical journey, because people went to places like Holywell here, to St. Winifred's Well, in hope of better health. They would dunk themselves in the water and in the hope of being healed or otherwise improved in their health. St. Winifred's Well was probably the most famous of all of the pilgrimage sites in the late Middle Ages, and it was the only one to survive the Reformation, because Henry more or less put an end to pilgrimage in Wales, but St. Winifred's Well actually survived and survives to this day. As I say, if you were a king, and some kings did come to Holywell, you came on horseback, but pilgrimage for the vast majority of people was on foot, and it could be lengthy and painful. The effort of walking on the pilgrimage was part of the experience. According to Pope Calixtus, about 1120, 3 trips to St. David's was equal to 1 to Jerusalem. And of course, if you were poor, you couldn't possibly think of going to Jerusalem, but you might be able to go to St. David's on 3 occasions. Strata Florida wasn't technically a pilgrimage site. There was no saint there. There was no healing well necessarily, but we do know that pilgrims did pass by. And this is a lead ampulla cover. A cover for a little water bottle. It was found in the Abbey gatehouse, and it contained holy water. On the front, you'll see there's a scallop, which the scallop of Santiago, generic symbol for pilgrimage. And then on the right is, it looks like a coat of arms, but nobody has been able to decipher it yet. In South Wales, Penrhys, which was a pilgrimage site for the Virgin Mary, was the most important site of all from the valley. And Madeline Gray, the scholar, has tracked the route which was taken by pilgrims, or one of the routes, from the Cistercian Abbey of Llantarnam, which was about 40 miles away, to Penrhys. It was quite a difficult journey. It meant overnight stays in lodges, maybe owned by the abbey. And of course, at the end, you had a really, really steep hill up to Penrhys. There was the image of the Virgin there. There was a hospital, a bath, and there were other buildings. And what you did was you stayed overnight. You prayed all night, more or less. In the morning, you got up, there were more services, and then you were immersed in the holy water. We know quite a lot about Penrhys through the poets, because Welsh poets, local Glamorgan Welsh poets, seem to have been paid by the site to advertise its existence. They seem to have received money for basically making up songs and poems to advertise the site. In North Wales, of course, there was an even longer trip along the North Wales coast, and then a very dangerous trip across sea to get to Bardsey Island and its entry. This is my walking companion, Chris West, by the way, at the very tip of Llyn, looking out towards Bardsey. 20,000 saints, of course, were allegedly buried there, but the main destination was the Abbey, ruins of which still exist. There's a tower there still, and there were many churches, some of them very large, like Clynog Fawr, where St Beno was, and also sacred wells, which you would call in at on the way along the North Wales coast. So that was a particularly long and, at the end, quite dangerous journey. My own favourite pilgrimage is to a really remote place, which is Pennant Melangell in northern Montgomeryshire, right at the top of the Tanat Valley. And that has a wonderful myth associated with it, the myth of Melangell, who gave sanctuary to a hare being hunted by a local nobleman. And it's really a wonderful and very, very peaceful place. But again, a remote place and a long, long walk to get there. In the Reformation, as I said, the pilgrimage came to a sudden end in the 16th century, except at Holywell. In Penrhys, Thomas Cromwell, Henry VIII's henchman, actually ordered the image of the Virgin Mary to be removed at night so that nobody would notice, and then it was taken to London and ceremonially burnt. Now, this picture, you can't really easily make this out, unfortunately, and I've taken this from a book. I haven't actually been here yet, but this is from the church in Llanelldid, just outside Dolgellau, and it's a stone with an imprint of a foot on it. The foot belongs to a man called Cynwrig, the same name actually as Gerald's prince at Strata Florida. And there's an inscription next to the foot, and it says something about starting out for foreign parts. And the word for foreign, peregre in Latin, suggests that actually he's going on a pilgrimage. So this looks as though he's planting his foot on this stone, as it were, as a mark that he's setting out on a pilgrimage. Roads were really poor, of course, throughout the Middle Ages, and long distance travel was very, very difficult. Roads hadn't actually been improved since the Roman times. And although parishes were supposed to keep roads maintained, in fact, very little happened. There was a day every month which people were supposed to use voluntarily to work on the roads. But nobody really ever did. And that's the origin of the phrase in Welsh, diwrnod brenin, day for the king, because it was that was the day in which you were supposed to do the roads, but it's actually synonymous with just lazing around and doing nothing. The long distance walkers par excellence at the end of the Middle Ages and well into the modern period were the drovers, of course. And they would drive cattle from West Wales, North Wales, South West Wales, all the way to the London markets. The reason for that was that Welsh cattle, Welsh meat, were highly prized by Southern English meat eaters. And there was a good price to be had, if you were lucky at least, if you could manage to get your cattle to market. On the left here is a picture by John Thomas, the 19th century, of, I think, Kilgerran, with drovers. You can see the drovers in the foreground and lots of cattle all being herded together. And the picture on the right, of course, is familiar to a lot of you, the Talbot Hotel in Tregaron, Tregaron being one of the main mustering stations for droves going over the Cambrian Mountains. We know quite a lot about the drovers, and one source is Welsh poetry. And in the 15th century, there's a rather good poem by, well, it's a rather bad poem actually, but a very informative poem by Gitor Glyn called Porthmona, Droving. And I'll just give you a little bit of this poem in my own translation. He says, he's in the persona of a drover, and he says, "Myself, off I went droving, though the trade was fast going to pot. I'd men hired on hand to drive the beasts, 2 of them in the lead, And in number 3 position, yours sincerely, the poet, over there. To Rieg, to Cefn-yr-Ice and Warwick I drove, to England, through every miserable ford, from waterhole to sink to Land's End. And at the end of the poem, Gitto says that the prices were really low when he got to London, and he had to sell his cattle at a loss. You can't really take this poem at face value, because it was actually part of a kind of poetic game, which he's playing with another poet called Tudur Penllyn, who writes a poem in response, and then Gitto writes a third poem in response to Tudur's poem. So you can't take them literally, but at least these poems, they give you an impression of the kind of laborious and really dangerous life of drovers. The first job that the drover had was to assemble the cattle, to buy them from a fair or direct from the farmer, and then bring them together and then get them on the road. Farmers and drovers who were in Anglesey, of course, had a particular problem because there was no bridge, at least not until quite late, over the Menai. And Arthur Atkin, who was an English tourist in 1776, gives a very, very vivid picture of how the drovers managed to get their cattle onto the mainland. He says, it fortunately happened that several herds of black cattle that had been reared in Anglesey were then crossing the strait on their road to Abergele Fair, where they were bought by drovers and disposed of at Barnet Fair, that's near London, to the farmers in the neighbourhood who fattened them for the London market. They were urged in the body by loud shoutings and blows into the water, and as they swim well and fast, usually make their way for the opposite shore. The whole troop proceeds pretty regularly until it arrives within about 150 yards of the landing place, when, meeting with a very rapid current formed by the tide, eddying and rushing with great violence between the rocks that encroach far into the channel, the herd is thrown into the utmost confusion. Some of the boldest and the strongest push directly across and presently reach the land. The more timorous immediately turn round and endeavour to gain the place from which they set off. But the greater part, borne down by the force of the stream, are carried towards Beaumaris Bay, and frequently float to a great distance before they're able to reach the Carnarvonshire shore. To prevent accidents, a number of boats well-manned attend, who row after the stragglers to force them to join the main body. And if the shore resounds with the loud bellowing of those that are landed, and they're shaking their wet sides, notwithstanding the great number of cattle that annually pass the strait, an instance seldom, if ever, occurs of any being lost, though they're frequently carried to the very entrance of the Menai in Beaumaris Bay. Well, coming back to Tregaron, Tregaron, as I said, was a great centre for collecting cattle. It had an awful lot of smithies where the cattle were shod. It also, by the way, had a lot of taverns, many more than just the Talbot and one or two others today. Edward Pugh, who was a Welsh artist at the beginning of the 19th century, has a wonderful picture of what happened to these cattle when they were being shod. It wasn't an easy business. He says, a man takes hold of the animal's nostrils with his left hand, and with his other grasps the right horn, at the same time placing his right heel round the animal's right foreleg. Thus, being ready for the throw, he summons up all his strength, and while he presses the horn downwards, forces the muzzles upward, and keeping his heel close with one great and sudden effort, brings down the animal on his right side. In the fall, the horn generally enters the ground, in which situation the beast is kept by the man lying on his neck. The blacksmith now engaged in tying all his legs together, and after this a pole 6 or 7 feet long is placed between his feet and belly, one end fixed in the ground, the other resting on the animal's side and held tight by the third person. The operation of shoeing is begun, which is done by affixing 2 small plates of iron on each hoof. So that's how the cattle were provided with these, they were called cuia, to get them over the long distance between Tregaron and London. From Tregaron, they then, of course, had to go over the mountains, not an easy option, all the way to Abergwynfi and then Beulah in Radnorshire and through the Midlands down to London. They tried to avoid, by the way, the turnpike roads because that meant shelling out money. So they often went by their own routes, including the one over the mountain, to avoid any extra cost. Most of the drovers actually walked alongside the cattle. They were helped by corgis. That was the point of corgis, to help with the cattle. The corgis apparently could find their own way home. So once they got to London, they just say goodbye to the corgis and the corgis would find their own way home. They had a boss for the troop of beasts, and he would go on horseback and went ahead to secure a place for the night for the herd, but the rest of them would just walk. And of course, there are lots of drovers' arms all over Wales and indeed England, where the drovers and their herds would take shelter for the night. The average speed was about 2 miles an hour. It's quite slow. They couldn't do much more than 15 miles a day, and it would take 16 miles to reach the English Midlands. They often kept away from roads, as I said, because of the turnpikes, and a lot of the drovers' roads, the special roads, survive today. So in the Harlech area to the Mawddach, and on the left here is pwnc, which is one of the bridges carrying the drovers' road on the road to the Mawddach, in the middle of nowhere, really. On the right is a house that I came across in a place called Stockbridge in Hampshire, which has a Welsh inscription written on its face, and it says "Gwair tymherus, porfa frasis, cwrw da, a gwal cysurus." So warm hay, tasty grazing, good ale, and comfortable bedding. So that's a message to these Welsh cattle drovers that they could have a good welcome there. The drovers would warn locals as they approached when they got into villages and towns. And John Jones, Jack Glanagors, in a satirical ballad, Dic Sion Dafydd, has this to say. I won't give it in Welsh. I'll just give it in English. At length, Dick went to London, his nose a yard from a lamb's tail, and on the way with his stick of ash, he shouted, "Hi, hup tro!" And that's what was shouted habitually by the drovers as they approached villages. They would eventually end up in English markets like Barnet near London. And in 1856, an English newspaper report actually gives a vivid picture of these drovers arriving. The writer says, "Imagine some hundreds of bullocks like an immense forest of horns propelled hurriedly towards you among the hideous and uproarious shouting of a set of semi-barbarous drovers who value a restive bullock far beyond the life of a human being, driving their mad and noisy herds over every person they meet, if not fortunate enough to get out of their way, closely followed by a drove of unbroken wild Welsh ponies, fresh from their native hills, all of them loose and unrestrained, as the oxen that precede them, kicking, rearing, biting each other amid the unintelligible anathemas of their inhuman attendants. The noisy hurrahs of lots of un-English-speaking Welshmen, who may have just sold some of their native bovine stock, whilst they are to be seen throwing up their long, worn, shapeless hats high in the air, as a type of taffy's delight, uttering at the same time a tirade of gibberish which no one can understand but themselves. Having sold their beasts, then the drovers, of course, had to come back to Wales, walking again, and very often carrying what portable objects they could, like money or legal documents or news, like ballads or newspapers or books. It's said that in 1815, it was drovers who brought the first news of the Battle of Waterloo back to Wales. Carrying money, of course, was dangerous, and that explains the rise of banks like Banc y Ddafad D in Aberystwyth and Tregaron, and Banc yr Eidion D in Llandyfri. Drovers' lives, as you can imagine, were very, very hard and economically very precarious, and drovers often went bankrupt. The railways, of course, put an end really to the droving habit, and John Thomas, the photographer, actually captured what he said were the two last drovers in Montgomeryshire. George Borrow in Wild Wales actually met one who had been a drover and had given up. Other people who were on the roads were tramps and eccentrics. This is one of them, Richard Robert Jones, better known perhaps as Dick Aberdaron. He lived in the early 19th century. He didn't really have any formal education, but he had an immense talent for languages. We call him a savant these days. Nobody would give him any employment, and he just wandered. He just walked all the time. He walked through Wales and England, and he had a special dress made for him with lots and lots of pockets in which he kept all his books. He was a kind of walking library. Books of all kinds, because he was working on a dictionary. He was working on a Latin, Welsh and Hebrew dictionary, which unfortunately he never finished. There's a description of him in 1822, which says this: his dress and person at this time were exceedingly singular. To an immense shock of black hair, he united a bushy beard of the same colour. His clothing consisted of several coarse and ragged vestments, the spaces between which were filled with books, surrounding him in successive layers, so that he was literally a walking library. Other big walkers in the late 18th century were nonconformists, early nonconformists. Howell Harris was one of them. He is alleged to have walked 6,000 miles every year. And John Elias, famous preacher, who walked with his followers to Bala from Anglesey to see Thomas Charles. That was a long journey too. And then you had Iolo Morgannwg. This is a picture of Iolo on the right, who was generally poor throughout his life, but walked hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles. From the 18th century, you get a completely different kind of walker appearing in Wales, namely the tourist. When the French Revolution arrived, it became a flood because the continent was then closed to most travellers. Before that time, most people had come for specific reasons, to study plants or antiquities and so on. But now people were coming to see the scenery and the experience of being in Wales and to see the mountains. They were influenced, of course, by contemporary ideas about the sublime and the picturesque. And many of them were writers and artists. And some of them included Welshmen like Thomas Pennant and Richard Wilson. This is Richard Wilson's wonderful picture of Cadair Idris. A figure that I'm particularly keen on in context of walking in Wales is this man, Samuel Taylor Coleridge. In 1794, he came for a tour of Wales with a friend called Joseph Hucks. Wordsworth, who was a kind of idol for Coleridge at the time, had been in Wales first, of course, but Coleridge was attracted by all the kind of romantic impulses around at the time, and particularly worship of nature. But he was also affected by political radicalism. As a young man, he was highly radical and believed in the French Revolution. For him, walking was actually a political act. It was a subversive act. It was even a revolutionary act, choosing not to go by coach or on horseback. It was also a way of meeting ordinary people, which was another romantic ideal. You think of Wordsworth, for example. Joseph Hucks, who was this companion of Coleridge in his tour of Wales, provides a kind of narrative. And there are also some letters from Coleridge from the time. Hucks says this: "We were so completely metamorphosed that I much doubt whether you would recognize us through our disguise. We carried our clothes, etc., in a wallet or knapsack. from which we have not hitherto experienced the slightest inconvenience. As for all ideas of appearance and gentility, they are entirely out of the question. Our object is to see, not to be seen. And if I thought I had one acquaintance who would be ashamed of me and my nutsack, seated by the fireside of an honest Welsh peasant in a country village, I should not only make myself perfectly easy on my own account, but should be induced to pity and despise him for his weakness. Along the way, I was really pleased to see, I knew nothing at all about this, while they were walking towards Wales through the west of England, Coleridge actually wrote a poem called Perspiration, a Travelling Eclogue, which is a wonderful poem. It's a very bad poem in one way, but a wonderful poem in another, because it gives you a perfect example of Coleridge's attitude towards travelling and travelling with the privileged. And I'll just read it to you. It's quite a short poem. The dust flies smothering, as on clattering wheel, loathed aristocracy careers along. The distant track quick vibrates to the eye, and white and dazzling undulates with heat, where scorching to the unwary traveller's touch, the stone fence flings its narrow slip of shade. Or where the worn sides of the chalky road yield their scant excavations, sultry grots, emblem of languid patience, we behold the fleecy files faint ruminating lie. I think it's a really bad poem, but you get the idea that they're walking actually in opposition to what he calls the loathed aristocracy who are careering along in their carriages. Coleridge was very keen on getting into trouble in Wales, and he'd gone through Montgomery and Welshpool and Llanfyllin and arrived in Llangynog. And this is what he says, Coleridge himself, about what happened there. Shortly after, into the same room came a well-dressed clergyman and 4 others, among whom the landlady whispered to me was a justice of the peace and the doctor of the parish. I was asked for a gentleman. I gave General Washington. The parson said in a low voice, Republicans, after which the medical man said, damn toasts. I gives a sentiment, may all Republicans be guillotined. Up stands the Welsh Democrat. May all fools be guillotined, and then you shall be the first. Whereon rogue, villain, traitor flew thick in each other's faces as a hailstorm. This is nothing in Wales. They make calling one another liars, etc., necessary vent-holes to the superfluous fumes of a temper. Well, you get the impression that Coleridge quite enjoyed stirring up that argument. Off he went then through Llangollen and Denbigh and Holywell and Penmaen Mawr, where he climbed the mountain and got lost. And then he tried to cross Traeth Lafan to Anglesey, again without success, and climbed Snowdon and Cadair Idris. This Welsh trip was really important for Coleridge because walking was an important activity for him. It was a revolutionary activity. And he did about 500 miles in a month, which is not bad going, before he then joined Wordsworth in the Mendips and Quantocks in Somerset and did even more walking. And that was, of course, the time when he wrote The Rime of the Ancient Mariner and Kublai Khan. So this was a really formative period for Coleridge, this trip to Wales. Wales left its mark on Coleridge, and he did a translation of one of the Hen Benillion, the old rhymes of South Wales. This is what he says. This is his translation of one of them. If while my passion I impart, you deem my words untrue, oh, place your hand upon my heart discreetly. Yeah, that's it. Later on, Coleridge was followed by lots of other tourists and increasingly people who were interested in the mountains and climbing them, because in the Romantic period, of course, mountains ceased to be wholly fearful things and became peaks to be enjoyed. And in a book called The Welsh Interpreter of 1831, Thomas Roberts. It's a kind of phrase book, Welsh English phrase book. Thomas Roberts has some wonderful English phrases for which he gives Welsh equivalents. And here are some of them. How long shall we be going up the mountain, that is? It is dangerous to take neat brandy when ascending the mountain. Can you carry my greatcoat? Must I have nails in my shoes to ascend that mountain? You are giddy because you look down. And then the final one is, where is the nearest surgeon to be found? There were other forms of walking which were becoming popular at the time. One, of course, was religious walking, the famous story of Mary Jones walking to Bala to get her Bible. Scientists were coming to Wales as well, including, sorry, I'm going too far now. That, by the way, is one of the pubs which Coleridge actually stayed in, I think, when he was walking through Wales. Scientists were coming to Wales. Michael Faraday and Charles Darwin both came, and then poets, of course, Tennyson, Gerard Manley Hopkins in North Wales, and Edward Thomas in South Wales. One of my favourite walkers in Wales, though, is Francis Kilvert. And he was in Cairo, of course, as a curate from 1865, and kept his diary from 1870 onwards. And he gives us lots of insights into walking. He couldn't afford a horse or a carriage, so he went round his very large parish just walking all the time. And in 1870, on the 13th of February, he gives a little portrait of himself walking. Went to Betws in the afternoon, wrapped in 2 waistcoats, 2 coats, a muffler and a mackintosh, and was not at all too warm. When I got to chapel, my beard, moustaches and whiskers was frozen to my mackintosh. A few days later, on the 26th of February, the weather's improved a bit, and he says, a lovely warm morning, so I set out to walk over the hills to Culver, which is about 5 miles away, taking my luncheon in my pocket, half a dozen biscuits, 2 apples and a small flask of wine. Took also a pocketbook and opera glasses. Went on up the Green Lane, very hot walking. Francis Kilvert was a very green man, a great conservationist. Always pained if bad things were happening to nature around him. In March 1872, he says, Cwm Gwanon Wood is being murdered. As I walked along the edge of the beautiful dingle and looked sadly down into the hollow, numbers of my old friends of 7 years standing lay below on both banks of the brook, prostrate and mutilated, a mournful scene of havoc, the road almost impassable for the limbs of the fallen giants. The new barn meadows are fearfully cut up by the timber carriages, which are hauling away the fallen giants, ash and beech. The shouts of the timber haulers feel how it, sorry. Yeah, sorry. Other walkers came as well, including women as the 19th century went on. And George Borrow, from the mid-19th century, he was a very unusual person because he was a very eccentric walker. The railways had arrived, but he refused to travel on railways by and large and insisted on walking. The other interesting thing about Borrow was how interested he was in the Welsh language. He was always wanting to test the Welsh that he'd learned as a young man, and was always wanting to get into conversations with people he saw about Wales and Welsh. There's not much written evidence about walking to work until quite recently, but one group of people we do know about who walked to work were the quarrymen who worked in the Carnarvonshire quarries but lived in Anglesey, and they were known as barracks workers because they would come on a Monday morning to the quarry and stay there all week and then go back home to Anglesey at the weekend. On Monday morning, workers at the Dinorwic quarry who lived on Anglesey, they would rise at 3 o'clock and walk to the Menai ferry at Moel-y-Don. They were easy to spot from the road, since a slate miner's clothes were distinctive. A white flannel vest, shirt and drawers, and a flannel belt. That journey might take an hour. And if the quarryman lived in Brynchenkin, but it could, a journey might take an hour if a quarryman lived in Brynchenkin, but it could take much longer if he lived in Llangefni or Llanech-y-Medd. After crossing, the men would then walk to the station of Felinheli, catch the quarry train to Dinorwic, arriving at 6:15 in the morning. Here they'd walk uphill, leaving their food supplies for the week in their barracks, and begin their day's work. They left off work and departed for home on Saturday, so that Sunday was the only complete day in the week when they could be with their families. School children, of course, also walked to work and walked to school. And Kate Roberts, in her book Tried Mewn Cyffion, recalls walking to school, the ysgol trwy'r, for the first time. This is how she narrates Owen, her hero, going to school. Owen started in the county school. There was no transport in those days, so he had to walk the 4 miles between home and school. He had plenty of company, lads on the way to offices and shops. They started out at exactly the same time every day, and they met everyone at the crossroads. If they passed a friend's house, they whistled as they approached, and the next moment he would be out at the gate. Owen had never known a more sociable crowd in his life. There was a certain silent understanding between them. No one spoke about it, but it was there. They rarely fell out, though they argued fiercely sometimes. But they were as one in their opposition to other groups who were walking the road. They never joined the girls walking to the school and the shops of the town. They tended to mock them, but they also admired them. Women, of course, were also walking. The most interesting one I've come across was Anne Lister, also known as Gentleman Jack, who kept a diary, a very frank diary about her lesbianism. She came to Wales with her married lover, Mariana, specifically to seek out the ladies of Llangollen, the famous ladies of Llangollen, very keen to find out about the exact nature of their relationship. And it's a very, very funny account of Anne Lister trying to get out of the ladies precisely what the nature of their relationship was. But the ladies were far too cautious to say. Well, we're now well into the 19th century, and in my researches for the book I'm writing, I'm now well into the 20th century, in fact, into the interwar period, which is a bit of a dark age for walking, as the motor car started to make its rise. So I've still got quite a long way to go. I'm just going to skip over some of these now. That's Kilvert. Here's Anne Lister. The 1930s, of course, brought the great age of the marches, the hunger marches, for example, and marches against unemployment. So that lies ahead of me for research. Continued, of course, in the age of Greenham Common there on the right. So demonstration and protest become extremely important in the 20th century. So do parks, the laying out of city and town parks and walking within them. There's also psychogeography of urban areas with people like Ian Sinclair and in Cardiff, Peter Finch, walking for therapy and for physical health, the Ramblers, and opening up the countryside to the public, the long distance paths movement, starting in Pembrokeshire. This is one of my heroes, Ronald Lockley, who more or less single-handedly invented the Pembrokeshire Coast Path. Also mountaineers, who become increasingly important in the 20th century. Art and walking, which becomes important with people like Simon Whitehead and Valerie Coffin Price. And then music and walking. Delith Jenkins, for example, who took a harp onto the Pembrokeshire coast path to play it for walkers as they went by. Walking for work isn't extinct either, because in the Amazon factory, for example, and the Amazon distribution centre, the workers very often walk many, many miles a day, picking off the shelf. And finally, we're now in the golden age of what I call the golden age of woman walking. There's a whole host of women who have been walking solo through Wales quite recently, in the last 10 to 15 years. Ursula Martin, who suffered from cancer and then took to long distance walking, has done all the long distance walks of Wales single-handedly. And Hannah Engelkamp has done the same sort of thing, but in the company of a donkey. And there are quite a number of other examples as well. So all these things are before me in the writing of the book. And I'm hoping that I'll find a publisher and be able to write and publish the definitive history of walking in Wales. So thank you very much for watching and listening. And if you've got any questions, I'd be very, very happy to try and answer them.
Thank you so much for that talk, Andrew. It was really, really interesting. I particularly like the individual who had the outfit with lots of pockets for all their books. I feel like that's something I'm definitely lacking in my wardrobe at the moment. Yeah, if anybody does have any questions, if you'd like to pop them in the chat, and I will ask them to Andrew. Just while we're waiting to see if there's any questions, one sort of idea that came to me while you were talking is, obviously there's the aspect of sort of hardship as part of a walk throughout a lot of history, and it's interesting now, a lot of people, if they're going for a walk and that's the activity they're doing, they might climb a mountain or do something like that, and it's got that element of struggle to it. It's not always just an easy walk. It's got a bit of hardship to make it worthwhile.
Yes, that's true. I think hardship is part of the experience of walking in a way. As you say, for recreational walking today or climbing, hardship is actually part of the experience. But we often forget that actually most people throughout history could only walk. They had no other, they didn't even have horses. They couldn't afford horses. So they had to walk to work or to sell their goods or for all sorts of other reasons. And it wasn't easy. It was certainly not easy. And of course, before certainly the 18th century, getting around the country, particularly if you had to go long distances, was really, really hard because there were no good roads. And it wasn't until the turnpike trusts came along in the 18th century that roads started to get improved. So before then, you had a hard time of it, and also sometimes a dangerous time.
Yeah, no, definitely. Is there a walk that's next on your list as part of your research for the book?
Well, quite a lot actually. I've got one or two sort of pilgrimage routes yet to be done. There is a north. It's worth saying that the pilgrimage, of course, has had a revival very recently, and a lot of kind of new pilgrimage routes or revived pilgrimage routes been devised. One of them goes right along the North Wales, not on the coast, but near the coast, North Wales. The old route from Holywell to Bardsey Island. So that's one that would be very interesting to do, I think. And then also one to Penrhys in Rhondda. That would be quite an interesting one as well, from Llantarnam Abbey.
Yeah.
That would be a really interesting one. But no, there are just far too many of them.
Yeah, far too many to choose. I've had a comment from Fiona saying thank you, really interesting. Pearl has raised her hand, so I'll see if she has a question. I'm not sure she does. If not, if anybody does have any questions, if you'd like to email them through to me, I can pass them on to Andrew and get back to you. And if there's anything you'd like to rewatch on the talk, I will be putting it on YouTube at some point.
If anybody has any interesting sources about walking, I'd be really interested to hear them, particularly if they're sort of out of the way sources about the history of walking. You come across things just by accident a lot of the time, rather than seeking them out. There are obvious people like George Borrow or Francis Gilbert and so on who come to mind, but then there are lots of less obvious people or people who are not known at all, which come out of newspapers or all kinds of sources, manuscript sources, and it's not always easy to know where to find that sort of information. So if anybody has any interesting kind of sidelights on the history of walking, I'd be really interested to hear.
Yeah, if anybody has anything, if you want to send it to info@strataflorida.org.uk, and then I can send that on to Andrew. Well, thank you again, Andrew, for your talk. It's been really interesting.
Well, thank you. It's work in progress. So as I say, if anybody has any ideas, let me know. And I'm at least 2 years away yet from actually producing a book, but I'm hoping it's going to be of interest to people.
That's great. And thank you everyone for attending. And if you would like to see more events like this, you can subscribe on Eventbrite and you'll get notified when we have other events, or if you'd like to join our mailing list, you can do that on our website. Thank you everyone, and I hope you have a good evening.